I'm 71 years old as I sit here saying this, and I've carried what happened longer than I carried my uniform. Longer than I carried my marriage. Longer than I carried the lie that some memories weaken with time. They don't. Some memories wait. They age with you. They change shape, but they never leave. They sit quietly, like something patient. Something that knows you'll come back to it eventually. I'm not recording this because I expect anyone to believe me. At my age, belief doesn't matter much anymore. I'm doing this because silence starts to feel heavier than truth when you get old. And because there are things you can only hold on to for so long before they start breaking you from the inside. For most of my life, I lived where people don't stay. Deep forest. Long winters. Roads that end without apology. I chose that kind of life deliberately. After the military, after the divorce, after the years when sleep came in short pieces and dreams came loud, the woods felt honest. Trees don't ask questions. Animals don't care what you've done. The land takes you as you are or not at all. I thought that kind of quiet would empty me. Instead, it made room. What I'm about to confess didn't begin with fear. That's important. It didn't begin with violence or screams or blood. It began the way most mistakes do, slowly, reasonably, wrapped in something that felt almost gentle. It began because I was alone. People like to imagine danger announces itself. That evil has a sound. That monsters roar before they step into your life. But the truth is, the most dangerous things arrive quietly. They arrive when you're tired. When you're hurting, when you've convinced yourself that companionship, any kind, is better than another year of silence. I lived out there for years without incident. No stories worth telling. No strange lights. No whispered voices. Just days that blended together and nights that felt long but predictable. I learned the patterns of the land, the seasons, the wildlife. When something was out of place, I noticed. That's why, when things finally changed, I noticed immediately, and I ignored it. That's the part I've replayed the most over the years. Not the end. Not the violence. The beginning. The moment when something felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. And I chose comfort over caution. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I'm not proud of what I did. I'm not presenting myself as brave or noble or misunderstood. I made choices that felt kind at the time and cruel in hindsight. I crossed a line I didn't even know existed. What followed cost me more than I can explain without taking you through it slowly. This isn't a warning story meant to scare you away from the woods. The forest wasn't the problem. I was my need, my loneliness, my belief that because something didn't hurt me at first, it never would. There was a time when what found me, felt like a gift. Like something meant only for me. Something that filled a space I didn't realize had hollowed out. That feeling didn't last. Love, when mixed with ignorance, can be dangerous. Love without understanding is still a kind of blindness. And blindness, in the wilderness, gets people killed. I didn't understand then what I understand now. And by the time I did, it was already too late. Before I ever set foot in that stretch of forest, I had already learned how to disappear. I spent my younger years in uniform, trained to observe without being seen, to endure without complaint. The military teaches you how to function inside noise, explosions, orders, urgency, but it never teaches you how to live once the noise is gone. When my service ended, I didn't come home to peace. I came home to absence. The marriage didn't survive the man I became. My wife tried longer than she should have. I don't blame her for leaving. I was distant, even when I was present, quiet in a way that felt cold, awake at night, and unreachable during the day. The war didn't follow me home as images or flashbacks the way people expect. It followed me as numbness. as a constant sense that I was slightly out of place wherever I stood. Loss came in ordinary ways. A parent gone before I could say what I meant. Friends scattered or buried. A life that narrowed without me noticing. Eventually, the world felt crowded in a way that made breathing difficult. Cities pressed in on me. People asked questions I didn't know how to answer honestly. So I left. Not all at once. At first, it was trips. Long weekends. Cabins borrowed or rented. Places where the cell signal dropped away and no one expected conversation. Over time, I stayed longer. Then permanently. I sold what I didn't need. I bought land no one wanted. The kind of land that doesn't appear in brochures. The forest I chose wasn't dramatic. No postcard mountains. No sweeping overlooks. It was dense, old, and patient. Trees grew close together, their branches knitting the sky into fragments. Sunlight arrived in pieces. The ground stayed soft year-round, layered with decades of fallen needles and leaves. What struck me most at first was the silence, not the absence of sound. The woods are never truly quiet, but the lack of human noise. No engines. No voices carried on the wind. No reminders of schedules or expectations. Just wind through branches, the distant knock of woodpeckers, the occasional movement of something unseen moving through undergrowth. The forest didn't welcome me. It didn't resist me either. It simply existed. That indifference was comforting. My days settled into routines that felt earned. I cut wood, repaired fences that didn't really need repairing, walked the same paths until my boots molded to them. I learned which animals passed through and when. Deer at dawn, coyotes further out, bears passing through but never lingering. Everything had a rhythm, and once I learned it, life became simple. Nights were harder. Without the distractions of people or electricity, your thoughts don't have anywhere to hide. I would sit on the porch with a lantern and listen to the dark. Sometimes I talked aloud, not to anyone in particular. Sometimes I didn't speak for days. There were stretches where I realized I hadn't used my voice at all. Loneliness doesn't arrive loudly. It creeps in. It settles into habits. It convinces you that you don't need much, and then quietly takes more than you notice. I told myself I preferred it this way. And for the most part, that was true. But preference and vulnerability can coexist. I began to feel like the land knew me. Not in a mystical way, just familiarity. My presence no longer disturbed the birds. Animals stopped freezing when they caught my scent. I had become part of the background, another fixed element in the environment. That's when I stopped feeling like a visitor. Looking back, I understand now that isolation doesn't heal wounds. It only gives them space. And space allows thoughts to grow unchecked. I became softer in some ways, more patient, more open to things I might have dismissed before. The forest teaches you to observe, to notice small changes, broken branches where there shouldn't be, tracks that don't quite match what you expect, shifts in behavior that signal imbalance. But it also teaches you that not every change is a threat. That belief settled deep in me. By the time things began to feel different, not wrong, just altered, I was comfortable enough to accept it without question. My routines continued. My days remained predictable. I slept well. I ate simply. I felt, for the first time in years, almost steady. There was nothing dramatic about that period. No warnings. No signs pointing forward or back. Just calm normalcy. The kind that lulls you into thinking the world has finally finished testing you. That was the state I was in when the first sign appeared. And because life had been quiet for so long, I didn't recognize it for what it was. I thought it was just another part of the woods, introducing itself. The first sign wasn't visual. It was sound, not a scream, not a growl, Nothing dramatic enough to trigger alarm. It was a low, uneven noise that didn't belong to any animal I knew. A strained, almost broken sound, like breath forced through something damaged. It came from deep in the timber, far enough away that it echoed strangely, bending around trees and terrain. At first, I dismissed it. The woods produce sounds that don't always make sense when you hear them out of context. Injured animals. Old trees splitting under pressure. Wind funneling through places it usually doesn't. I told myself it was one of those things. Something ordinary that only felt unfamiliar because I was alone. But it didn't stop. It came again the next night. And the next. Always at roughly the same time. Always from the same direction. Never closer, never farther. Just present. Consistent. Waiting. Still, I wasn't afraid. Fear comes from immediacy. From threat. This felt distant, contained, almost restrained. There was no aggression in it. No urgency. If anything, it sounded tired. On the fourth night, I took my lantern and followed it. That decision didn't feel reckless at the time. It felt responsible. When you live alone in the woods long enough, you develop a sense of stewardship. You notice when something is out of balance. You intervene when you can. I had helped injured deer before. Freed animals caught in wire. This felt like that. The sound led me to a shallow ravine choked with brush and fallen timber. The air there was heavy, thick with the smell of wet earth and something else underneath it. Musky, unfamiliar, but not rotten. Not sick, just strong. That's when I saw movement. At first, I thought it was a bear. The size fit. The mass. But bears don't move like that. This thing shifted its weight differently, favoring one side. It rose partially upright, then settled back down again, clearly in pain. The lantern light caught pieces of it, not the whole. A broad shoulder. Dark, coarse hair that reflected light unevenly. A limb that bent at an angle that made my stomach tighten, not because it was grotesque, but because it was wrong in a quiet, biological way. I stayed still. I remember noticing how calm my breathing was, how steady my hands felt. That's what unsettles me now. Not the sight, my lack of reaction to it. When it turned its head toward the light, I saw the face. Not fully. Just enough. The muzzle was longer than a human's, but the structure beneath it wasn't animal simple. There was complexity there. Muscle control. Expression. The eyes reflected the lantern in a way I had only ever seen in people. Not intelligence exactly, but awareness. Recognition. It didn't bare teeth. Didn't charge. It just watched me. We stayed like that for a long time. I should have left then. Every instinct trained into me said to back away slowly, put distance between myself and something I didn't understand. I knew that. I felt it. And I ignored it, because what I saw next wasn't threat. It tried to move and failed. The injured limb gave out, and the sound it made then, that's what decided things for me. Pain has a universal language. You don't need to understand a creature to recognize suffering. I told myself I was helping an animal. That lie made everything else easier. I didn't approach all at once. I sat, lowered myself to the ground, let the lantern rest beside me. I spoke softly, not words meant to be understood, just tone. The way you talk to something frightened. It didn't retreat. Over the next hour, I learned small things. It understood space, understood intent. When I moved slowly, it relaxed. When I shifted too quickly, its muscles tightened. We were negotiating without language. I fashioned a splint the way I'd been trained to do in the field. Improvised, careful. When I touched it, it flinched, but it didn't strike. It endured. That's when the bond began, not because it trusted me. Because I trusted myself. I brought food the next day. And the next. I stayed at a distance, respected boundaries. Over time, it allowed more. Presence became routine. Routine became expectation. I needed a way to think about it, to categorize it, to make it fit somewhere in my mind, so I named it. I won't say the name here. Names carry weight. But once I gave it one, it stopped being something and became someone in my thoughts. And that's when the real danger began. Not with claws or teeth, but with attachment. Because once you name something, walking away feels like abandonment. And I didn't walk away. I stayed. Once the routine formed, it settled into my life as naturally as the seasons. I didn't bring it to my cabin. I knew better than that. Some part of me understood boundaries even then. Instead, I adjusted my life around the place it had chosen. A bend in the ravine where fallen trees created natural cover. I cleared just enough brush to move safely, careful not to make the space look altered from a distance. I learned how to approach without announcing myself, how to leave without making it feel like withdrawal. Food came first. I brought what I could carry without drawing attention. Scraps at first, then fuller portions once I understood what it would take and what it would refuse. It never scavenged mindlessly. It inspected. It chose. It left what it didn't want untouched, which told me more than hunger ever could. The injury healed slowly. Too slowly for something that should have been purely animal. I cleaned it when it allowed me to. Sometimes it would pull away, not aggressively, just decisively. Other times it stayed still, watching me work with those eyes that never quite let me forget what I was dealing with. Weeks passed. Then months. The sounds at night stopped being alarming and started becoming familiar. I could tell when it moved, when it slept, when something in the forest disturbed it. There was a rhythm to its presence that folded itself into my days. And then there was another one, noticed a second before I ever saw it. The air felt different. The silence had weight again. When it finally showed itself, it stayed farther back, half hidden, observing both me and the injured one. Taller. Its posture was different, not cautious, but assessing where the first felt restrained, even gentle in its movements. This one carried itself with certainty, control. It didn't approach me. It didn't need to. That was when I understood. I wasn't dealing with an isolated incident. The dynamic between them was unmistakable. The second positioned itself between the injured one and the wider forest whenever I was present. Not threatening, not overtly, but clear. It set boundaries without violence. The first deferred. Always. I adjusted again. I brought more food. Left it farther out. Never turned my back fully. I learned to read their spacing, their posture. Over time, the second allowed me closer, though it never relaxed the way the first did. It watched everything, remembered everything in my mind, without realizing it. I began to think of them as a pair. I didn't give the second a name the way I did the first. That wasn't accidental. Names imply closeness, responsibility. I kept that distance intact. Even as I crossed others, the days became predictable. Morning checks, food placement, quiet observation, evenings spent nearby, not intruding but present. I spoke sometimes, not because I expected understanding, but because silence felt heavier when shared. The first responded to tone more than words. Subtle shifts, a tilt of the head, a softening I never expected to see in something built the way it was. Trust doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates. There were moments that caught me off guard. The first bringing something it had hunted and placing it near where I sat. Not offering, not demanding, just sharing space. The second allowing me to remain when it fed, though always watching. I told myself I was witnessing animal behavior, but animals don't negotiate like that. Years passed. I age-marked time now by events, not dates. The winter when snow buried the ravines so deeply I worried they'd leave. The spring when I realized they hadn't, that they'd adapted. The summer when I noticed smaller tracks mixed in with theirs, lighter, less defined. I never saw the young clearly, and I didn't try to. That was another line I didn't cross. I stayed where I was allowed. I convinced myself that restraint equaled wisdom. My routines expanded. I learned where to hide evidence of my involvement, how to erase my own tracks, how to make my presence invisible to anyone who might wander too close. It felt practical, necessary. I told myself I was protecting them. The truth is, I was protecting what they had become to me. Family is a dangerous word. I didn't use it out loud, but it settled into my thoughts anyway. Not family in the way people mean it. Not warmth or laughter or shared memories, but presence, continuity, belonging. For the first time since leaving the military, I felt needed. That's not something you admit easily at my age. They never followed me back to my cabin. That was another boundary that held. But when I was gone too long, I could feel it. The way the forest shifted when I returned. As if my absence had been noted. The first would approach closer than before. The second would watch longer. The young stayed hidden, but their existence was undeniable. Everything was quiet, stable, too stable. I should have recognized that peace isn't permanent in the wild. That equilibrium requires constant adjustment. Instead, I grew comfortable, complacent. There were moments, small ones, that unsettled me. The second standing taller when something unknown moved through the woods. The way the first sometimes watched me when it thought I wasn't paying attention, eyes fixed in a way that felt less curious and more. Evaluating. Once, I found a deer torn apart closer to my cabin than any kill should have been. Not eaten, just ended. I told myself it was coincidence. Territory overlap. Natural behavior. But I moved my routine slightly farther out after that. That was the pattern. Adjustment instead of departure. Compromise instead of distance. Nothing bad happened. Not yet. Years slid by like that. Quietly. Almost peacefully. A life balanced on agreements that were never spoken. And if you had asked me then, I would have told you I had found something rare. Something delicate. A coexistence no one else knew about. I didn't understand then what I understand now. Peace isn't proof of safety. Sometimes. It's just a pause before something realizes it has grown beyond the boundaries you imagined. And though nothing had broken yet, something had begun to change. I could feel it, even if I refused to name it. The first time, I realized I was wrong about what they were. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden revelation or a moment of terror. It was a small, quiet thing, the kind that slips past you unless you're paying close attention. And by then, I was always paying attention. I had begun leaving food in different places, partly to keep patterns from forming, partly to test something I didn't yet have words for. When I placed it farther than usual, behind a fallen log that required a leverage to move, I didn't expect it to be touched on. It was, not dragged, not clawed at randomly. The log had been shifted just enough, rolled and wedged so it wouldn't slide back, using balance, not brute force. The food was untouched except for what had been taken. No waste, no frenzy. That stayed with me. Then there were the marks, not scratches, not territorial signs, arrangements. Stones placed where there hadn't been stones before. Branches bent and woven together at heights animals don't bother with. Paths suddenly redirected, not blocked, just guided. I told myself intelligence existed on a spectrum, that I was projecting meaning where there was none. But the forest has its own logic, and this was deliberate. The second one, the dominant one, learned faster. It began anticipating my movements. When I altered my approach, it adjusted its position before I arrived. When I lingered longer than usual, it stayed farther back, as if allowing space rather than demanding it. Once, when I spoke aloud, not to them, just thinking through a problem, the first tilted its head and shifted in a way that matched the rhythm of my voice. Not the words, the cadence. That was when unease crept in. Animals respond to tone. I knew that, but this felt like comprehension brushing against the edge of understanding. Not language, not yet, but awareness of intent. There were moments when I felt observed, even when I couldn't see them. Not hunted, studied. The feeling you get when someone knows your habits better than you realize. One evening, I arrived to find the food already portioned. Not eaten, separated. Larger pieces moved closer to where the younger ones stayed hidden. Smaller remains left farther out. It wasn't instinctual distribution. It was planning. That night, I didn't sit as long. The wonder didn't disappear. If anything, it deepened. To witness something like that, something undocumented, something intelligent existing quietly alongside us, it felt like standing at the edge of a truth no one else would ever see, but wonder has. Wait, it presses on you once it stops feeling harmless. I began to understand that what I thought was trust might have been tolerance, that what I believed was routine might have been observation. They were learning me the way I had learned them. Patterns, limits, responses. I started limiting how much I spoke, how long I stayed. I watched more than I acted. Still, I didn't leave, because leaving would have meant admitting I no longer understood the situation. And that's a difficult thing for someone with my background to accept. Control is comforting. Illusions of it even more so. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable, when I realized the balance had shifted. I had stepped into the ravine at an unusual time, earlier than normal. The second was already there, positioned exactly where it would have needed to be to intercept me if it chose to. It didn't move. It just waited, not surprised, not startled, expectant. I stood there longer than I should have, lantern hanging uselessly at my side, and for the first time since this began, I felt something close to fear. Not because it might attack me, but because I understood then that it could, and that it had chosen not to. That realization changes the shape of a final relationship. From that point on, every kindness felt conditional. Every routine felt provisional. I told myself I still had influence, that familiarity meant safety, but a quiet thought had taken root, and it wouldn't leave me alone. I wasn't in control of this situation anymore. I might never have been, and whatever I thought I was raising, helping, or protecting had grown far beyond the boundaries I'd imagined. I just wasn't ready to admit it yet. The change didn't arrive all at once. It crept in the way rot does, slowly, quietly, hidden beneath things that still looked solid on the surface. The forest began to feel smaller, not physically, but emotionally. Paths I'd walked for years started carrying tension instead of familiarity. Game trails shifted. Deer stopped passing through certain areas entirely. Coyotes went silent for stretches that felt unnatural, then returned skittish, and thin. Territory was tightening. I noticed markings first. Not crude signs of dominance, but deliberate ones. Trees gouged higher than before. Soil disturbed in long, measured lines rather than frantic scrapes. Boundaries were being reinforced, not declared. This wasn't instinct. It was strategy. The dominant one spent more time upright. Not fully, not in a way that screamed threat, but enough to remind me of its height, its reach. It placed itself between me and the ravine more often now, forcing me to pause, to wait for permission that was never spoken. I told myself it was protective. That lie lasted longer than it should have. The first, the one I'd named, changed too. It became quieter, less expressive. It deferred faster. When it approached me, it did so cautiously, glancing back more often than before. Trust hadn't vanished, but it had been constrained, like something allowed rather than chosen. There were nights when the forest erupted with sound far from my cabin, sudden, violent disruptions that ended too quickly. I found remains later. Not eaten, not scattered, just silence. Discipline, not hunger. I stopped venturing as far. Adjusted again. Compromised again. Each adjustment felt reasonable in isolation. Together, they formed a retreat I refused to acknowledge. I also began keeping secrets from myself. I avoided certain thoughts. Skipped over conclusions that rose too easily. When you've invested years into something, admitting failure feels like erasing part of your life. I wasn't ready to do that. And then things began to disappear. Not people, at least not that I ever learned of, but signs of human presence. Old trail markers vanished. Equipment left by loggers farther out turned up damaged or gone. Once, a distant campfire I'd noticed over several nights simply never returned. I told myself people move on, but the forest remembered. The dominant one watched me more closely now. Its posture changed when I lingered too long. When I altered my routine, it adjusted instantly. Not reactive, anticipatory. Dominance isn't always loud. Sometimes it's silent certainty. The younger ones, I saw them once, briefly, at a distance I hadn't been allowed before. Larger than I expected, watching me with a stillness that felt practiced. Learning without participating, that realization unsettled me more than anything else had. I had convinced myself I was part of something rare, something balanced. But balance implies equality, and there was none. I was tolerated because I had been useful, because I had been familiar. And familiarity can wear thin. The moment it should have ended. Everything came one evening when I stayed too long. I'd brought food later than usual. The forest was wrong that night. Too quiet, too tight. The dominant one was already there, blocking my usual path. I waited. It didn't move. So I did something I hadn't done before. I stepped around it. Just a few feet. Not aggressive. Not rushed. But deliberate. The response was immediate. Not an attack. Not yet. But a sound I hadn't heard from it before. Low. Controlled. Close enough that I felt it in my chest more than my ears. The first retreated instantly, positioning itself behind the dominant one. Eyes never leaving me. In that moment, every illusion I had built cracked at once. I understood then that I had crossed a boundary I was never meant to test. That whatever patience had been extended to me was not endless. That I was no longer seen as a caretaker or a presence, or even a tolerated anomaly. I was something else now. A variable. I left without completing what I'd come to do. Walked back to my cabin slowly, deliberately, forcing myself not to look over my shoulder. I didn't return the next day. Or the day after. And in the silence that followed, something shifted permanently. Because the forest doesn't forget when you challenge. It. And neither do the things that rule parts of it you were never meant to belong to. I stayed away. Longer than I meant to. At first, it was caution. Then it became fear. The quiet kind that convinces you that waiting is wisdom. Days passed without incident. Nights stayed silent. The forest didn't come for me, and that almost felt worse than if it had. I told myself distance would reset things. That was another mistake. When I finally returned to the ravine, I didn't bring food. That choice alone should tell you how far things had shifted in my mind. I carried my rifle instead, not raised, not ready, but present. A reminder. For them, or for me, I'm still not sure. The air felt wrong immediately. The forest was too still, as if holding its breath. I advanced slowly, senses stretched thin, every instinct warning me that whatever balance once existed had already collapsed. I saw the first one before it. Saw me dot, it was thinner. Its movements were restrained, almost stiff. And there was blood on its side. Not fresh, but not old enough to ignore. The wound wasn't from hunting. I recognized the pattern. The angle. Dominance had been enforced. I should have left then. Should have turned and walked away without another step forward. But something in me, guilt, attachment, arrogance, pushed me closer. That's when everything broke. The dominant one emerged without sound, positioning itself between us in a single fluid motion. No hesitation. No warning. It had already decided how this would go. I raised my hands, backed away slowly, tried to de-escalate a situation that had moved beyond negotiation. The sound it made then was different from before. No restraint. No control. Pure assertion. It charged. I don't remember aiming. I don't remember thinking. Training took over, ugly, efficient, automatic. The bond I'd built over years collapsed under the weight of instinct in less than a second. The shot echoed through the ravine, like a betrayal. The dominant one didn't fall immediately. It veered, stumbled, then turned away, disappearing into the timber with a sound that will follow me to the end of my life. Not rage, not pain. Fury. The first one screamed. There's no other word for it. The sound cut through me in a way nothing else ever has. It didn't attack me. It didn't flee. It stood there, torn between instincts I had no right to witness. I didn't wait. I ran. Not fast, controlled. The way you move when you know being careless will get you killed. Branches tore at me. Roots tried to pull me down. The forest closed in the way it always does when something ancient decides you no longer belong. I made it back to the cabin with lungs burning and hands shaking. I didn't stop to pack. Didn't clean. Didn't look back. I left that night. Abandoned everything I couldn't carry in my truck. Years of routine, of coexistence, of lies I told myself about control and understanding. By morning, the forest was quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet. It was the kind that follows violence. The kind that settles over something broken and waits to see what remains. I never returned to that ravine. Whatever bond I thought existed ended there, shattered by a choice I will live with for the rest of my life. One pull of a trigger erased years of patience, trust, and denial. There was no victory in it. No relief. Only the sudden understanding that I had never been part of something peaceful. I had been standing inside a fragile truce, and I was the one who broke it. I didn't feel safe even after I left. Distance didn't bring relief. It brought absence, and absence has a sound of its own. The first night away from the forest, I slept in short, shallow pieces. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that scream again. Not the sound itself, but what it meant. Confusion, betrayal, loss. I knew, even then, that nothing I had done could be undone. For days, I drove without a destination. I avoided mirrors, avoided silence, avoided thinking about what might still be alive back there and what might not be. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to stop. And that's when the grief settled in, not all at once, but in waves that left me hollow afterward. I had told myself I was protecting something fragile. In the end, I destroyed it. I never learned whether the dominant one survived. I don't know if the wound was fatal or if it carried the injury back into the woods to heal the way wild things sometimes do. That uncertainty is part of the punishment. If it had died, I would carry that weight. If it lived, then I had created something far worse. A survivor with memory. The first one. I don't believe it lived long after that night. That belief isn't based on evidence. It's based on understanding. It had lost its position, its protection, The fragile space it occupied between trust and submission had been erased in a moment. In that world, that kind of weakness doesn't last. I think about it often, alone again, calling into a forest that no longer answered the way it once had. And I know, without certainty, but with conviction, that whatever bond we had did not survive me. Grief for something like that is difficult to explain. There was no body to bury, no ritual, no language for the loss. I couldn't speak about it to anyone without sounding unhinged or cruel. So I carried it quietly. I let it shape me without witnesses, for a long time afterward. I couldn't be near forests, not because I feared what might be there, but because of what wasn't. The woods felt emptier than they ever had before, and that absence accused me every time I stepped beneath the trees. The silence no longer felt indifferent. It felt earned. I stopped thinking of them as creatures. That's another truth I resisted, whatever they were. They had been more than animals and less than people, and losing them hurt in a way I had never experienced. Not like losing a friend, not like losing a family member, like losing a shared reality, something only I had known, now gone forever. I tried to tell myself I had done the right thing, that survival justified everything, that the wilderness doesn't allow for sentimentality. But those explanations felt thin, defensive. They never reached the part of me that needed them. What I missed most wasn't the routine. It was the presence, the knowledge that somewhere, not far away, something watched the same sky I did, that I wasn't entirely alone in my awareness. That connection, flawed, dangerous, and misunderstood, had filled a space I hadn't known how to name. And then it was gone. There was no relief in that loss. No sense of closure. Only a widening emptiness where something living had once existed. I had separated myself from it physically, but emotionally, I was still standing in that ravine, lantern light shaking, realizing too late that love without understanding is just another form of arrogance. Whatever remained in that forest after I left, it no longer belonged to me. And I no longer belonged anywhere near it. That was the true loss, not the ending of a bond, but the knowledge that I had forfeited the right to ever seek it again. What stayed with me afterward wasn't fear. It was grief. And grief, unlike fear, does not fade with time. It simply learns how to live inside you. Time passed, the way it always does, indifferent and unhelpful. I settled eventually, not back into the forest, but near it. Close enough that the land still pressed against my thoughts, far enough that I could pretend I wasn't listening for it every night. I told myself I was done with that chapter, that whatever remained belonged to the woods now, not to me. Fear had replaced affection, not the sharp kind that makes you run, but the dull, constant awareness that something unresolved had been left behind. Love had once made me reckless. Fear made me cautious in ways that felt older than my years. For a long time, nothing happened. No signs, no disturbances, no proof that anything I'd known still existed. That absence was its own kind of torment. I couldn't decide which possibility weighed heavier, that it was all gone, or that it was simply waiting. Then the signs returned. Small things at first. Tracks where no tracks should have been. Not near my home, but along roads I took regularly. Heavy impressions in soft earth that vanished as soon as I tried to follow them. Trees marked at shoulder height. My shoulder height, not randomly, but in places where they would be seen. Once, I found something left near my truck. Not a threat. Not a message meant to intimidate. A reminder. I won't describe it in detail. Some things don't need to be shared to be understood. It was enough to tell me that whatever survived that night remembered me. Remembered the shape of my presence. The way I moved through space. The forest felt closer after that. I began noticing shadows at the edge of my vision. Not chasing. Not approaching. Just present long enough to confirm awareness. Then gone. When I stopped walking, the forest stopped with me. When I turned back, nothing followed, at least not in ways I could prove. The fear wasn't of being attacked, God, it was of being known. I stopped carrying a weapon. That might sound strange, but I understood by then how meaningless it would be. Whatever line had been crossed couldn't be defended with tools. Only distance, and even distance didn't guarantee safety. The final sign came years later. I was older, slower, less certain of my own senses. I told myself often that age plays tricks on the mind, that memory can manufacture patterns out of regret. One morning, I found my old trail leading into the woods blocked, not violently, not destructively, but deliberately. Branches woven together the way I'd seen before, at a height that required intention, effort. The message wasn't hostile, it was final, do not return. Stood there longer than I should have, feeling something stir that I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Not hope, not connection, recognition, I never crossed that barrier. I turned back, slowly, and walked away without looking over my shoulder. Some things don't require confirmation. Some boundaries exist for your own good. There was no closure in that moment. No understanding reached. No balance restored. Just an acknowledgement that whatever bond once existed had transformed into something else entirely. Coexistence had become distance, and distance. I learned is not the same as peace. I still listen at night sometimes. Old habits don't die easily. But the sounds I hear now belong to ordinary things, wind, animals, weather, whatever else moves through those woods no longer announces itself to me, or perhaps it never needed to. I don't know whether what I encountered still lives. I only know that it remembers, and that knowing is something I will carry for the rest of my life, unresolved, unanswered, and heavy in ways no explanation could ever make lighter. I've had many years to think about what I did. Too many. Perhaps time has a way of sanding down the sharp edges of memory, but it never removes the weight. It just redistributes it. What once felt unbearable becomes something you learn to carry quietly, the way you learn to live with an old injury that never healed properly. I used to tell myself I acted out of compassion, that I intervened because something was hurt and alone, and I knew what that felt like. There is truth in that, but it is not the whole truth. The harder truth is this: I wanted to be needed. Isolation had stripped me down to something raw. When I found something that responded to my presence, that allowed me into its world, I mistook permission for belonging. I confused tolerance with trust, and I let that confusion guide decisions that should have been made with distance instead of emotion. Love, I've learned, is not enough, not when it's mixed with ignorance, not when it ignores imbalance, not when it asks something wild to bend itself into a shape that makes you feel less alone. I didn't understand what I was dealing with, and I didn't want to. Understanding would have required restraint, withdrawal, admitting that some things exist beyond our reach for a reason. I crossed that line willingly. Whatever those beings were, and I still don't have the right words, they were not meant to be integrated into a human life. Not as companions, not as secrets, not as experiments in coexistence. They existed within a structure older and more rigid than my feelings ever could be. And when that structure reasserted itself, I was the fragile element. I don't tell this story to warn people away from the woods. The wilderness is not the villain here. It is honest. It shows you what you are without commentary. I tell this for the people who believe that patience equals control, that familiarity equals safety. That because something hasn't harmed you yet, it never will. That belief is dangerous. If you ever encounter something you cannot categorize, something that watches instead of reacts, that learns instead of flees, walk away. Do not linger. Do not name it. Do not build routines around it and call them peace. Distance is not cruelty. Sometimes it is respect. There are things in this world that do not need to be conquered, documented, or understood by us to exist. They are not waiting for discovery. They are not seeking connection. They simply are. And when we insert ourselves into their world out of loneliness or curiosity, we become the disruption. I live quietly now. I don't venture far. I don't seek answers. Some questions are not meant to be resolved within a human lifetime. What happened to me didn't end with a clear conclusion. There was no final reckoning, no lesson neatly tied off. Just consequences that continue without spectacle. I don't know if what survived that night still moves through those forests. I don't know if it ever forgave, or if forgiveness even applies. I don't know if my presence marked something that will outlast me. And that uncertainty is part of what I carry. If this story unsettles you, let it. Not because of fear, but because of humility. The world is larger than our need to understand it. And not everything that feels like connection is meant to be held on to. Some bonds are. Warnings. I've told you this not to cleanse myself of guilt. That's not possible, but to ensure the weight of what I learned doesn't disappear. With me, I am an old man now. The forest no longer calls to me the way it once did. But some nights, when the wind moves just right, I remember how close I came to believing I belonged somewhere. I never truly did. And I remind myself of the only truth that has lasted. Some doors are not locked to keep us out. They are closed to keep something else in.